So Natalie and Sam will be talking today about the SEND system. This is a system that is really relevant to our work at YF. We know that children who are cautioned or sentenced for a serious youth violent offence are more likely to be first issued with an EHC plan later compared to non-offending children. And we know that of children in youth custody or children involved in the justice system, that a significant proportion of them have special educational needs or disabilities. So the SEND system is hugely relevant to us and hugely relevant to our work. And we've started to commission various bits of work on the SEND system. We've commissioned some qualitative work and also some secondary data analysis. But we're really keen to learn more about the system, learn more about the challenges within the system and what should happen and what changes should be made to it. So in that context, really delighted to welcome both Natalie and Sam from ISOS Partnership. They've worked in collaboration with the Local Government Association and the County Council Network to produce a really fantastic report that diagnoses the challenges with the current SEND system and then looks to provide some recommendations on how we can make this a more inclusive system. You may have seen in the last week that Ofsted have been speaking a lot about the importance of inclusion. This is a really live topic at the moment, and so it couldn't really be timed any better. Just to introduce Natalie and Sam specifically, Natalie is the director at ISOS Partnership. She's specifically an expert on SEND, so fantastic to have her here, and has led lots of high-profile research, including research on SEND funding and AP. And Sam is the head of research and insight at ISOS Partnership. He's currently delivering a range of projects for central and local government, exploring what works in local SEND systems. So without further ado, Natalie and Sam, I'll hand over to you. And Natalie, I believe you've got some slides to share.
I have. Thank you very much for that introduction. It's very kind of you, and thank you for inviting us, because it's always really interesting, I think, to talk. SEND is a topic that I've spent quite a lot of time thinking about and writing about over the last 10 years, but it's always really refreshing and really nice to talk to a slightly different audience about topics that you're quite familiar with, because it always leads you into different ways of thinking and new insights. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And I suppose I should say, from my point of view, and hopefully from your point of view, we'd very much like to treat this as a conversation. I have got some slides, but do feel free to ask questions, post things in the chat. I know that probably the audience that we've got here, some of you will probably know quite a lot about the SEND system, some of you might not know very much at all. So if anything doesn't make sense or I'm using jargon that you've never heard of, then just pull me up on that. Sam's going to be supporting in the wings. He'll be able to answer questions, field some of the discussion as well. So without too much further ado, I'll share my slides and then get into the presentation. But as I said, do feel free to ask questions and interact, and there'll be time for some discussion at the end. This is where I just hope my technology works for me. Bear with me. Moment. Sorry, I'm just trying to get it into slideshow mode. Hopefully has that come up for everybody now?
Not yet, Natalie. It looks like it's gradually loaded.
It gradually gets
afternoon cake. Yes, I can see it.
Yeah. Okay, lovely. Fantastic. So this piece of work, the title sort of says what it does. The title is, what does a financially sustainable system that meets the needs of children and young people with SEND look like? So this was commissioned by the County Councils Network and the Local Government Association, published in July this year, but was probably took about a year's worth of work to get to the point of publication. What I'm going to try and cover in the presentation today is, first of all, what the exam questions were that we were asked through this piece of research. Secondly, what the scale of the challenges in the SEND system. Thirdly, sort of some brief observations on the current government's improvement plan. Fourthly, our ideas for what you could do differently to make the system both more effective and more sustainable. And then some other, which I've called other relevant research insights. I hope they're relevant. I was just trying to think through where the points of intersection are between what you're interested in the YEF and some of the things that we've learnt over the years around SEND. So I've put some things in at the end that we can talk about together. In terms of the exam questions, we were asked to look at 3 key things. First of all, what is causing the current set of challenges in the SEND system? Secondly, does the government's improvement plan for SEND go far enough to address those challenges? And then thirdly, if the answer to that is no, and without a spoiler alert, the answer to that was no, what further proposals might you need to put in place to make the system more effective, more sustainable, and effectively deliver better outcomes for children and young people? In a way, the research was a little bit different to your typical research project. We weren't asked to start with a clean sheet and go and explore what was working and what wasn't working in the SEND system. There's been so much written over the years and such a high degree of consensus that the system is essentially broken, that the starting point was slightly different. It was more, let's acknowledge that there are some really, really fundamental problems here, and let's understand what's causing them and what we could do differently to address them. In terms of the scale of the challenge, first of all, a few quotes. I'm not going to read every single one out, but these are just illustrative of what we heard from all the different sectors that we spoke to. So whether that was head teachers, or whether that was directors of children's services in local authorities, whether it was colleagues within the health system, or parents, carers, or indeed young people themselves, consistently what we were hearing was the system is broken. So a few kind of facts and figures to back up that statement. The first is just the number of children and young people with education, health and care plans. So the education, health and care plan is, if you like, the statutory document which sets out what a young people's needs are, what support they require in order to have those needs met, and it will also specify where that child or young person should be educated. So it is for children and young people with SEND, and it is for those typically whose SEND requires a level of intervention and support which is greater than what you would typically find in a mainstream classroom without sort of additional support being put in place. It's quite a loose definition, and that's because actually the definition in law is very loose, and that's something we'll come on to later. But if you just look at the number of children and young people with EHCPs as an indicator of the demand for support in the system, and what you can see is between 2010 and 2024, there's been an absolutely massive growth in children and young people with EHCPs, and almost all of that growth has been since the introduction of the SEND reforms in 2015. You can see that most of that growth is accounted for by your sort of 5 to 19-year-old age range. In 2015, the reforms extended responsibility for children and young people with SEND up to the age of 25. So you can see that that sort of orange line of 20 to 25-year-olds is the cumulative impact of that reform coming into place. The 16 to 19 group, interestingly, perhaps for your perspective, is the, in percentage terms, the most rapidly growing group. But when you look at the data, if you look at what sits behind this, it's not that new children or new young people, I should say, are being identified in that category. That stayed relatively stable over the period. What's happening is the bulk of young people who've been identified earlier are now moving through into that 16 to 19 age range. You also see it's a bit misleading on this chart because of the small numbers involved, but there's also been very, very rapid growth in the 0 to 5, 136% in recent years. But to understand the growth in needs requires a little bit of more understanding about the primary needs that sit underneath this. And it's not true to say that needs are just growing in a similar way across all different categories. What you actually see is that almost all the growth is being fueled by children and young people whose primary need is either autism, social, emotional, mental health, or speech, language, and communication. Now, there are all sorts of difficulties in the sort of robustness of those primary need categories, and what you often see is that children who might be identified with social, emotional, mental health needs at a later stage becomes apparent that they also have needs around neurodiversity, similarly with speech, language, and communication. But those three categories of need, however imperfectly described, account for 88% of the total growth, and all the other categories of need combined have only grown by 20% over the period. So that growth of 120, 130, 140% we've seen is largely coming from children and young people with ASD, social, emotional, mental health, and speech, language, and communication. So challenge number one is we just have many, many, many more children and young people in the system requiring support. Challenge number two is that more and more of those children and young people are needing to have their education provided in a specialist setting rather than in a mainstream education setting. So the sort of grey and dark grey shaded area shows the growth in children and young people with EHCPs in mainstream schools and units within mainstream schools. The blue and orange bars show the growth in children and young people in special schools. And while the special school population hasn't grown quite as fast as the mainstream population, what you can see is just in terms of actual numbers, there are now, sorry, I can't see my own slide at the end because of where the camera picture is, but nonetheless what you can see is 50 to 60,000 more children now in mainstream special schools, another 20-30,000 more in independent and non-maintained mainstream schools. And that independent and non-maintained special school sector puts real pressure on the system because the average costs of education there are often double the average cost in a state-funded special school, which is again more than the cost of education in a mainstream school. Understanding again this profile of use of special education, if you dig into it a little bit further, what you see is predominantly these are male. So they're about 70% of the special school cohort is male. That's roughly equivalent to the percentage of EHCPs who are male, and very, very heavily skewed towards the 11 to 15 age range, as you can see in that chart. In fact, 4% of boys, so 1 in every 25 boys between the age of 11 and 15 is in a special school, which I think is fascinating, is about double the rate of special school usage for other age ranges. And I think poses some really interesting questions about whether our mainstream education is configured in the right way if so many boys between the age of 11 and 15 are not thriving there. It's also interesting to note, and this might be of relevance to your focus, particularly on youth crime and youth justice, is that alternative provision for young people with EHCPs is actually, it's a very small minority of placements. Less than 1% of all children and young people with EHCPs find themselves in alternative provision, but it is the fastest growing type of placement, and you can see that numbers have more than doubled since 2015 of children and young people with EHCPs in alternative provision. I think we could talk a little bit more about the reasons for that and the implications. Key fact number 3 then, so you've got more children and young people needing support. You've got more of those in more specialist provision, which means unsurprisingly it's costing more than it ever has before. So the cost of providing SEND provision has trebled since 2015 is projected to treble between 2015-16 and 2025-26. This is putting really significant pressure on local authority budgets. The current unfunded deficit, cumulative unfunded deficit for special educational needs is around 4 to 5 billion, we project. So this is money that has been spent, which is just sitting in a sort of a deficit account in local government finance. And so we've got more and more children in the system. We've got more and more in specialist education. We're spending 3 times as much as we did previously, and yet outcomes haven't got any better. So these 2 lines, the blue one shows children and young people with EHCPs achieving level 2 at age 16, 17, 18 and 19 in 2015-16. So this was before the SEND reforms were introduced. And the orange line shows the equivalent set of figures for 2022-23. So you can actually see for children and young people achieving level 2 by ages up to 19, the situation has actually got quite considerably worse than it was before the reforms were introduced. If you look at outcomes at the end of primary, at Key Stage 4, you see basically a flatlining of performance for children and young people with SEND, and you see the gap between them and their peers staying very much the same, and in some cases increasing. We also know that satisfaction with the system is getting worse. The number of cases brought before the SEND tribunal go up every year. They're now a considerably higher proportion of all appealable decisions than they were 10 years ago. And our survey, we carried out a qualitative survey. It was relatively small. I think we got about 150 responses, but we asked people to agree or disagree with these statements, whether the SEND system is currently financially sustainable, whether investment is at the right level, whether it's fair and equitable, whether it's supporting good outcomes, and whether resources are allocated fairly against need. And against all those questions, we had above 90% of those responding disagreeing with those statements. So a sort of a fairly damning consensus on the current state of support for children and young people with SEND. So why have we reached this challenging situation? First of all, well, we've sort of tried to identify 3 root causes of the challenge that now faces the system. And if you're interested, I can talk to you more about these. There's obviously a lot more detail in the report. But first of all, there's what we called a volume challenge, that the system is really struggling to respond to the ever increasing changes in both need and demand for support. And we think that there are a range of different factors that are contributing to that increasing demand. Partly it's the sort of the national rhetoric around the system. I think 10, 15 years ago, national government was much more ready to talk about inclusion, and that has changed. Secondly, the SEND reforms themselves have increased demand. What the reforms have effectively done, without necessarily meaning to, but they have made it increasingly difficult to access support without an education, health and care plan, which means the incentives to seek an education, health and care plan are incredibly strong. They've also increased the age range, as I talked about, and that in itself has created an extra set of sort of inflationary pressures on the system. There have also just been bigger changes in mainstream education policy around curriculum, around accountability, inspection, qualifications, all of which make it more difficult for mainstream schools to be inclusive rather than less difficult. One of the things we heard a lot when we were talking to schools is that they are inclusive despite the incentives in the system rather than because of it. And then the wider reduction in support services for children and young people in families, the impact of 10, 15 years of austerity just means that there is less capacity in the system to flex and to make room for those children and young people who need something a bit different to their peers. So there is a volume challenge. Then there's a decision-making challenge. There is a real lack of clarity in legislation about how SEND and about how education, health and care plans are defined, which means that those boundaries are very difficult to maintain and sustain in a consistent way across local government. The responsibilities and accountabilities with the different partners in the SEND system are not well aligned, and you have many instances where particular bodies are responsible for things for which they have no power, and where the alignment of sort of influence, budget and levers and then accountability is simply not there. And the SEND Tribunal creates, we would argue, a very distorting effect within the current system. This is an area where there is a lot of contention. We could spend, you know, an awful long while talking about the tribunal system, but the tribunal finds almost universally in favour of parents when cases are brought, and this is no doubt because local authorities are not following the law in terms of what the law says that they should provide. Having said that, I think that is an indication that local authorities, some are not following the law because they've done things wrong, but many of them are not following the law because they simply can't, because the system is so broken that they're at an impasse. And I think the tribunal is at the very pinnacle of that system and creates some when you know that any decision can be overturned at the tribunal and that 90% of cases that are brought there, the decision is overturned, it creates a very different environment and landscape for decision making around placements. And then finally, in terms of the market challenge, the operation of the independent sector is a real provides is a real stumbling block in the system, if I can put it that way. The independent sector is there to both serve the needs of children and young people who have what we might call low incidence and high complexity needs that are not necessarily met in their local schools, but it's also increasingly become a place that meets the needs of children and young people where there simply isn't enough places for them in their local schools, and has also become somewhere where parents might look to send their children because they're attracted by the range of possibilities that might be open within the independent sector. The cost of the independent sector is very high, and the opportunities for local government who are the commissioner to commission that in a strategic and planned way are very limited. So that's our kind of diagnosis of what's not working in the system. The government has put together an improvement plan, and many of the proposals in the improvement plan, I think, are sensible and moving in the right direction, but the fundamental message that we heard from everybody that we spoke to in the sector, whether that's, and you can see the respondents here, whether that's education, health, local authorities, parent carer fora, all of those actors were saying, effectively, although there are some sensible things in the improvement plan, they are not going far enough in order to address the really fundamental challenges that we face. Nothing short of wholesale, complete reform is going to get us back to a semblance of sustainability and indeed effectiveness. So if the government plan doesn't go far enough, and I think also many would argue doesn't go fast enough, because although the plan has been out for a couple of years now, not much has changed. What are we proposing would make for a more effective future approach? Just in terms of setting the scene, what we've argued really strongly is that reform of the national approach to SEND is now essential. The system has got to such a point that we can't get away without it. And that it's unavoidable, that the choice is now when reform is needed, not if reform is needed, and that the root causes are systemic in nature. All the individual actors in the system are acting in a rational way given the incentives in that system. You're never going to create more sustainability and better outcomes for children and young people unless you fundamentally realign those incentives to lead to a different type of behaviour amongst all those actors. So we asked those who responded to our survey what they thought might be needed to create a more effective and sustainable system, and you can see the three things that came out highest were increasing investment, creating a more inclusive system, and improving access to support services. But you can see that there are some interesting differences between different respondents. So for example, you can see that parents and carers are perhaps less wedded to the idea of creating an inclusive system than perhaps local government or health respondents are. Perhaps unsurprisingly, parents and carers think that the power of parent and carer voice is a more important factor. Perhaps unsurprisingly, local government was more in favour of strengthening local authority powers. So different actors had different areas where they put their emphasis, but broadly increasing investment, the more inclusive system and improving access to support services were where people felt that attention needed to be paid. So we came up with a set of 8 sort of high-level areas of reform, and under each one there are sort of many contributing proposals. First of all, we think there needs to be some work done around setting the national strategy around SEND. So setting out a new national ambition around twin principles of enabling inclusion and preparing for adulthood, and then enshrining some statutory expectations at a national level around needs and the support that should be available for children and young people with different levels of need. We think it's important to have these set out nationally because at the moment there's an awful lot of inconsistency between local areas, and we think it's important that these should be legally enforceable because that is what then gives you the expectation of this is what every child and young person with a need of this level is entitled to, but it also gives you the expectation of what they're not entitled to. And I think one of the interesting observations that we heard from several people that we interacted with as part of this research is that in the SEND system, the state has lost the ability to set out clearly what is provided by the state and what is not provided by the state. And there are some interesting comparisons, say, with the health system, where there is a degree of patient choice, but actually there is a very clear set of expectations around what can be provided by the National Health Service and what can't be provided by the National Health Service. And I think within SEND, we've absolutely lost that clarity. The next set of recommendations are firstly around building capacity for inclusion in mainstream education. And as the flip side of that, reforming the statutory framework that sits around mainstream and special education, and then preparing children and young people for adulthood. So some of the things that we're recommending here is what you would need to do to build inclusive capacity in mainstream schools. That's around putting in multidisciplinary support, really ramping up training, changing the way schools are funded, and addressing those wider bits of the system, including curriculum, accountability, buildings, performance measures, which all currently mitigate against inclusion. And you would need to think very differently about what does your curriculum look like to really include all young people with children, all young people with SEND. How would you measure accountability so that you would celebrate the success of those settings that are most inclusive whilst also shining a light on those that are not? We talk about trying to reframe the role of special schools, both in terms of meeting the needs for those children and young people who have the most complex needs, but also providing more outreach and a more porous transition between mainstream and special sectors. We think early years is absolutely critical in terms of resolving access issues, workforce and funding, and supporting parents as first educators. And then in post 16, we think there is both the same approach around reforming funding and investing in multidisciplinary teams, but I think the key thing here is around strategic place planning in order to enable more effective transitions. The controversial bit of this is probably what's in number 4 here, around how you would then reform the statutory framework. And what we're suggesting is a tighter definition of special educational need, which would be linked to your national expectations. We're talking about reframing the role of education, health and care plans. So actually, the large majority of children and young people with SEND would not have an education, health and care plan. They would have a learner record, which would set out what support they need, and the expectation is that that support would be met in a mainstream environment. Education, health and care plans, in our sort of reformed vision, would be for that most complex end of the spectrum, where you really need cooperation between education, health and social care, and where the large majority of those children and young people would be in a special setting. We think there needs to be a real reform of the admission system, so there might be much more equity of parental choice for children with and without additional needs, and a completely different system for looking at rights of redress, looking very differently at how the tribunal and other rights of redress operate. In terms of preparation for adulthood, at the moment we have a strange situation in that the age of transition is different for children and young people with SEND, whether you're talking about transitioning with a health need, whether you're talking about transitioning into children's social care, from children's social care to adult social care, whether you're talking about transitioning into education. So we think there needs to be a standard child adult transition age across all agencies. We're talking about the idea of creating a new destinations and progression service to support enhanced transition, and a simpler framework for transition. And we've tentatively set out the idea of 3 different pathways, which we could talk about a little bit more if that's of interest. Then the underpinning conditions are around having local inclusion partnerships that bring together health, education, social care, parents, young people and others who are jointly responsible and accountable for this system, and new strategic powers around market shaping. And all of this would need to be underpinned by a system-wide workforce strategy, which is looking at the whole array of workers, from teaching assistants, teachers, all the way through to speech and language therapists, youth workers, etc., who work with children and young people with SEND. How you might achieve this, I won't go into this in detail, but essentially we're talking about a 5-year transition to the new system, and you would need to keep effectively 2 systems running in parallel. You would need to build your inclusive capacity in your mainstream schools, your colleges, before you begin to reform the statutory framework, because you can't take away those safeguards that people rely on before you have a system that gives people the confidence that their children and young people's needs can be met in a different way. So that's what we learned through the research. That's where our thinking has gone around how the system could be shaped differently. And now there is sort of some interesting debates going on between different sectors, different bodies, around what the future of the SEND system looks like. We will need national government to take a lead on this. So to some extent, we're looking to influence that debate, but also looking to the government to see where they come out, particularly, with a new government in place. And we hope to be able to have some of those conversations over the next 6 months. Just very quickly, trying to think about the sort of relevance of the SEND system for the work that you do in YEF, I think there are some very specific challenges for the 16 plus SEND cohort. And I've talked to some of those within this research. Transition planning into adult services is fraught with difficulty. The question about when you transition and how you transition, but also importantly, the level of support that's available after that transition are all very contentious issues. And some of the language you hear is around where the cliff edge is, how far the cliff edge gets pushed back, how you prepare how you can prepare young people for that cliff edge, but it's all around this sort of diminishment of support as young people hit adulthood, and the paucity sometimes of options for young adults with SEND. Linked to transition, I think there's a really interesting debate about how do you develop independence in key areas like housing, employment, travel, and what types of settings, support and interventions are most effective in building that independence to allow young people with SEND to live sort of their most effective lives. A big issue that we hear from young people themselves and from parents is around that broader sense of inclusion. Access to activities is something that is very poor, I think, for young people with SEND. Being able to join sports clubs, youth clubs, other things that they might want to do outside of school, often particularly for those, I think, with particularly complex neurodiverse conditions, there simply isn't the support out there to make that kind of wider landscape accessible to them. And broader issues around inclusion in communities. When we talked to young people as part of this research about what they understood about inclusion, they were very strong about their wish to be included in their local school, and talked a lot about how not being included in their local school can lead them to not being included in their broader community, that their friends might not live locally, that they might be travelling a long time to get to a placement. Ceasing plans is a very live debate. Local authorities have responsibility for young people with SEND up until the age of 25, but that is responsibility for their education, and there are difficult and complex debates that go on about at what point a young person is ceasing to learn, and at what point then their education and health and care plan should be ceased. And I think that is a very difficult issue, which is not helped by the lack of alternative options for young people with more complex needs to have a fulfilling experience outside of education in an appropriate setting. And then I think there are some interesting questions about, the very large majority of young people with SEND go to FE after the end of statutory schooling, and lots of those young people thrive there. But I think there is, as ever, real inconsistency in the quality of support that's available in college. And certainly what we hear from the post-16 sector is that transition planning, again, is very patchy, and often learners will turn up without the college necessarily knowing what their needs are and what support needs to be put in place to help them. And then just a few other thoughts to kind of feed into the mix, which may be of interest to you. Some other research that we've been involved with London councils and with the NCB, I think, is pointing to a subset of young people in the system who are, for want of a better way of doing it, have become very hard to place. And I think that subset is young people with SEND, young people with complex mental health issues, and young people with risk-taking behaviour. And when you get to the middle of that diagram, we're certainly hearing from directors of children's services that sort of emerging cohort of young people who they're not able to find suitable places for, whether that's in independent special schools, whether it's in residential care accommodation, whether it's sometimes in secure accommodation. those places aren't available, and those places are extremely costly when they are available. They're often not very good quality, and there simply isn't at the moment a sort of strong system response or range of provision available. I'm not sure that the system necessarily knows what works for those young people, what they should be commissioning, and I'm not sure the market has been able to provide that. So I think this is a point of tension in the system. The other point that I wanted to draw out is just the risks of children and young people not being in school. And we know that that's a big risk factor when you think about some of the issues that you're concerned with around being at risk of crime, or being at risk of being a victim of crime. We know that children and young people with SEND are about 3-4 times as likely as their peers to be permanently excluded, and 3 or 4 times as likely as their peers to be suspended. We know from work, so there was some interesting work carried out by Croydon LSCB that looked at some of the antecedents of violent crime, gang activity, CSE, and one of the big things that came out of that was fixed term exclusions in primary school. We know from work that's really recently been carried out by the Children's Commissioner that children with SEND are about twice as likely as their peers, I think, to be missing from education. So SEND, I think, is a real risk factor for not being in school, or not being in school enough, and what that then leads to further down the line. And then just a final thought that I wanted to lodge with you is that we talk about earlier intervention. I think we also should be talking about much earlier intervention. So there's been some really interesting evaluations done of the Sure Start system by the IFS recently, which showed that Sure Start, although it increased the identification of special educational need at 5, significantly decreased the proportion of children and young people who required an education, health and care plan at ages 11 and 16, whilst also increasing performance at GCSE, particularly for those for low income children and those for deprived backgrounds. So there's something about that under 5 intervention that I think is really powerful, and something we should all be thinking about further. Let me, and then just some questions for discussion. Any questions you've got about our research? Anything that you would want to talk about in terms of the interventions that are sort of most effective for some of these young people, what the policy sweet spots are that where there's an intersection between what might improve the life chances for all young people with SEND, and perhaps what might improve the life chances of that smaller subset of young people who you're thinking about, who might end up at risk of crime or violence. So let me stop sharing my screen now and just be really like any comments, any questions, observations.
Fantastic, thanks Natalie, that was absolutely brilliant. Not only did you just present it brilliantly, it just underpins what a colossal project it is, and you've really taken on every element, right, of the SEND system, and I love how the recommendations that you're suggesting are addressing all of those elements, right. I thought that was fantastic. Thank you. I'm going to kick us off with a question. I know that there will be colleagues that are chomping at the bit to ask questions as well, particularly given some of the professional experiences that colleagues have that are on the call. So you mentioned accountability, particularly accountability in terms of mainstream schools, and we've been really heartened actually by the noises that Ofsted have started to make in the past few weeks, particularly following the finish of their Big Listen project, and they've said that inclusion is likely to play a role in what schools are how to account on. I suppose my question there would be, what should Ofsted be looking for in schools? What should schools be doing, and actually is Ofsted the right team to do that? And then there's a second part of that in terms of Ofsted. You mentioned and you're spot on. Young people who are suspended and excluded from school are hugely of interest to us, just because of the later association with involvement in violence. One of the things that we're really worried about there is the rise of unregistered provision, and how many children are in unregistered provision. It's just growing all the time. And I imagine that there are a lot of children in those settings that have SEND needs as well. Is that something that you found in the research, and is that also a concern that you share, and should Ofsted be starting to regulate the settings? There's a lot in that. Go for it, Natalie.
Thank you. That there is a lot in that, and I'll try and do it justice, but I might not. So in terms of accountability, similarly, I'm really heartened by what Ofsted have been saying. I think there are probably two things that Ofsted needs to be looking at. No, three things actually, maybe. The first and most obvious one is, what is the quality of provision that is made available for children and young people in that setting, and how are they progressing? And I think we know quite a lot now from work of the EEF and others about what good quality provision looks like. And I think, to be fair to Ofsted, they have got quite a bit better at that, over the years. I think the two things that perhaps Ofsted haven't looked at much previously and ought to be looking at is who's in the school. So is the school reflective of its wider community, or are there indications that the school is, what we hear a lot of is schools who are, the conversation with a parent goes, of course you can apply to this school for your child, but you ought to understand that our ability to support the needs of this child are very restricted, and actually we feel that your child would thrive a lot better in the school down the road, because they have a much better SEND unit, SEND support system, whatever it is. That sort of exclusion by the back door, or indeed before a parent even gets to the front door, I think is really common, and that's something that Ofsted needs to find a way into. Interestingly, you talk to people in a local area, and everybody knows the schools that are doing that. So it's not a secret, but it's not explicitly looked at as part of the system at the moment. And then I think the other bit is around exclusions, and around what track record do they have of actually being able to keep young people with SEND in school and thriving in a positive way. So not just about kind of keeping them in a corridor sitting on their own because they can't manage their behavior or any other ways. So that's what we would hope. I mean, I think it would be really interesting at Ofsted. I mean, it would cause ructions in the sector, but if Ofsted made inclusion a limiting judgment, that would certainly really ramp up attention on it. Making safeguarding a limiting judgment, I know it's had some negative consequences, but it's really, really ramped up attention on safeguarding. In terms of unregistered provision, it wasn't something that came out very much in this piece of research, because we, just in terms of making things manageable, we did make the decision not to look in detail at AP, because there was just too much. However, we did a piece of work a while ago now, it might be 6 or 7 years old, I suspect, where we did look in some detail at the AP system, and even then the use of unregistered provision was rising rapidly. I think that at the time there were some really interesting debates around, sometimes unregistered provision can be really valuable because it does something that your other types of provision can't do, and it can reach out to young people who wouldn't be in any sort of provision otherwise. But I do think it's a real risk, and I think personally I would be in favour of greater inspection and accountability for unregistered provision, but I think the key is you've got to get the framework right. I don't think it works trying to inspect unregistered provision as if it were a school. I think you've got to come up with a new framework with quality standards, with safeguarding standards, but which recognises that often unregistered provision is trying to do something different. But sorry, that's based on quite outdated information, and the world may well have moved on since then.
No, I don't think it has too much. And I mean, you've done a huge review anyway on the massive SEND system. Certainly don't expect you to have covered AP as well. I'll come to Ema first, and then actually, Ema, if you could do your question, and then Ellie, if you could do your question as well, and then we'll come back to you, Natalie.
Cool. Thanks, Natalie. That's really interesting. I resonated a lot with what you said about the post-16 opportunities for young people with additional needs. So I used to work a lot with young people with additional needs in schools more widely. And what we found a lot was young people would transition out into college, and they may attend college for a couple of weeks and then find it quite difficult because of the lack of support, and they would have got a lot of support at their previous special school, and kind of get lost in the system then. So it's kind of thinking about who's accountable for that young person then. Is it the college that they've attended for a couple of weeks, or is it the school that they would have attended until they were 16? And no one kind of really knew then where the young person was or what they were doing with their lives, and a lot of the times ended up neat. So I suppose that's just a reflection and kind of resonates with what you were saying. My other point was on employers, and sometimes employers' resistance to employ young people with additional needs, particularly when they have quite severe learning difficulties. And is there any scope maybe in this, or maybe not in this, but something to think about holding employers to account? So they're giving young people these work experience opportunities so they can then thrive post school, because a lot of these young people would do very well in a workspace, but would have to be quite tailored to their needs. So I suppose just reflection and some thought.
And Ellie, if we go to you with your question as well, then I'll hand back to Natalie.
Hi Natalie, thank you so much for that. I was thinking about your your two key principles. So like, inclusion makes complete sense to be in there, as do I think from kind of all the research I've worked on with young people, like in preparation for adulthood. I really think that that's something that the young people I've worked with. But I think tell me if I'm wrong, but I imagine it might be a bit of a tougher sell to not have kind of immediate markable outcomes. So I was just wondering how you're going to kind of be making that argument, and how it kind of got into the top run, because I really think it should be.
Thank you. Both really, really good questions and interesting observations. So just in terms of Amar, your points, I absolutely agree. We definitely heard those issues around transition to college and young people falling out of the system because they're not supported, and we know that employer resistance has been a real issue for a long time. One of the things that we wanted to explore through this is this idea of a progressions and destinations service, which would be around providing a much more hands-on and continual sort of oversight of support, if you like, and we would need to debate the age ranges, because partly this is, at what age range do you say, right, this young person is an adult? So is this a 16 to 21 service? Is it, there are all sorts of technicalities there. But one of the things that we were interested in thinking about is, I'm sure this is an oversimplification, but it felt to us like that it might be helpful to think about young people in that phase in three very broad groups. And we're not trying to pigeonhole people, but this is just a way of sort of trying to segment the system a little bit, because I think you have your group of young people who will broadly be going on the same path as their peers, i.e. they will either be going into college, or they will be going to university, or they'll be going not to university at 16, they'll be going to do A-levels, potentially then university, they'll be going into jobs, and they will broadly be following the same path as their peers, and they may need a bit more help to get there, but we're not talking about something radically different. On the other extreme, you've got a set of young people whose eventual destination is likely to be pretty much full-time daycare or residential care. These are your most complex young people. And in a way, transition for those young people, though it's not perfect, often works a bit better, because everybody knows who they are. Everybody's known who they are since they were 5, often. And although the range of opportunities for those young people are, I think, much more restricted than we would like them to be, at least everybody's got a handle of who they are and where they are. And then I think the most difficult group is the group in the middle, who actually have real opportunities to lead an independent life, to hold down a job, to have a family, to do the things that we would all hope for our children, but who need quite a lot more support to get them there. And I think that's the space where actually doing something really targeted, perhaps with a not with every employer, but with a small number of employers would be really, really beneficial, because I think those are the people with the right structured support and learning and that goes around it could really thrive, but who might just end up in daycare if you don't do that. Around inclusion and preparation for adulthood, I think it's really interesting. So some of the debates that we had as part of this research was trying to get back to, what do we really think the SEND system is for? What are we spending all this money? What are we putting all this time and effort in for? And so obviously, in terms of immediacy, it is about ensuring that children, young people can thrive throughout their education. But the end goal is around trying to say, how do we prepare them for the most successful lives that they can have in adulthood? Just like the end goal of education for all other children is eventually, how can we prepare them for the most successful lives they can have in adulthood? And so we were keen to put that in as the vision, just to get us back to, this is what we're trying to aim for. Because if we're clear that that's what we're trying to aim for, we can also be equally clear that we're woefully missing the mark at the moment, that children and young people, despite all this effort, are not better prepared for adulthood. All the sort of core data on inclusion of young people and indeed fully grown adults in the adult world, in health, in employment, in housing, it all remains dire. So in a way, we're trying to reorientate the system there. And inclusion, I think, is interesting because it's no one ever feels like they can disagree with inclusion as a concept. We all want to be inclusive, but I think what we're trying to highlight through this piece of research is that if you're really serious about inclusion, then that does involve doing some things really differently and making some really hard choices. So it does potentially mean thinking very differently about our curriculum. It does mean thinking quite differently about how we fund education institutions. It does also mean, I think, and this is perhaps the most controversial bit of all, I think it does mean having some quite serious conversations about parental choice in all of this system, because for a range of very understandable reasons, parental choice over the last decade has tended towards more and more specialist forms of provision. Now that, I think I would argue, is because actually the mainstream provision is not meeting children, young people's needs. But so long as we have that situation, then we're in a vicious circle, because the more people choose and opt for specialist education and specialist provision, the more money is then devoted to that bit of the sector, which leaves less for early intervention prevention, which means your mainstream provision is less inclusive. So I think inclusion is something that is a good for children, young people with SEND, but it is a good for society as a whole. But I think if we want to be serious about it, we have to be willing to make some of those really difficult decisions. So I think people might, to long answer to your question, I think people might be quite keen on these as concepts and be less keen on the policy implications of some of these concepts when we actually get there. But we'll see. Maybe I'm being overly pessimistic.
Fantastic. Thanks, Natalie. Hugely appreciate your time this afternoon. It's so refreshing to hear someone present that has such a deep knowledge of the system and such a complicated system as well. So thank you so much. And actually, in terms of next steps on this, you've left it quite a nice point there. What we're going to be doing, as we've discussed previously, is in the spring we're producing some policy recommendations for government on what they should do to protect children from violence. SEND is going to be in there. So we're going to really be drawing on your findings here, and I am sure that we will be contacting you in the next few months to discuss what those are. But thanks again. I've had colleagues message me throughout this presentation to say how impressive it is. So thank you. We really appreciate it. And I'd encourage colleagues to have a look at the report following this chat.
Lovely, thank you. It's been lovely to meet you all and have this conversation. The report's a bit long, but there is an executive summary, so read the executive summary.
Fantastic. Thanks, Natalie. Really appreciate it. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks, Natalie.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good to see you. Bye.